She sat alone at her son's wedding, hiding millions from her husband. Why didn't she regret it? Subscribe and see other stories. Would you tell your story? Grace woke before the dawn broke, the gray light of Atlanta pressing gently against the thin curtains that hung by the kitchen window. The house was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the slow, deliberate tick of the clock above the stove, each second a reminder that the day was moving whether she was ready for it or not. She sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, letting her feet find the slippers she placed neatly each night, her hands resting on her knees as she listened to the early hush that filled the house, a hush that was neither comforting nor oppressive, but simply there, like the faded photographs on the wall and the small cracks on the kitchen tile that had appeared over the years without notice. The air was cool as she shuffled into the kitchen, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove, watching the slow steam begin to rise as she prepared her coffee. She took her cup and stood by the window, looking out at the small yard where the grass grew unevenly, and the wooden fence leaned slightly where the storm last spring had pushed it. Her eyes traveled to the flower bed she had once tended with care. Now, a patch of stubborn earth and a few determined weeds that clung to the soil, their green defiance a quiet statement against the dry Georgia sun. It had been years since she planted the tulips that had never bloomed on time, but she still watered the patch, a habit that had become a part of her morning, a ritual that meant she was still here, still tending to something. On the wall beside the kitchen table were photographs of Michael, arranged in a collage she had crafted during one of her rare days off long ago. There he was, toothless and laughing in a small blue onesie, holding a toy truck on the floor of their first apartment. Another picture showed him on the front steps, a backpack too big for his small shoulders on his first day of school, his eyes bright with a courage he didn't know he had. In another, he wore his high school graduation cap, standing next to her as she smiled, her eyes already glistening as she thought about the man he would become, about the dreams she had for him that were larger than the small frame of that moment. Grace poured another cup of coffee, adding a spoonful of sugar, though she knew she shouldn't, and carried it to the small kitchen table where the morning paper sat unopened. She unfolded it, the paper crackling in the quiet, but her eyes barely moved across the headlines. They blurred into words she had read before, stories of neighborhoods changing, of people she would never meet, and places she would never see. She set the paper aside, pressing her palm against it for a moment, grounding herself as she glanced at the empty chair across from her, the one that Mark had once filled, his laughter filling the kitchen as he teased her about using too much sugar, the way he would reach over and squeeze her hand without saying anything at all. It had been 4 winters since Mark passed, the quiet in the house settling deeper with each season. At first, the silence had been heavy, pressing against her as she moved from room to room, folding his clothes, dusting the frame that held their wedding picture, standing in the doorway of the bedroom they had shared, unable to step inside without seeing him sitting at the edge of the bed, tying his shoes, humming softly to himself as he prepared for another day. Over time, the silence changed, becoming something she lived alongside rather than something she battled, though some days it felt as if it pressed closer, whispering in the spaces where his voice used to be. Grace worked the night shift at the hospital, the long corridors illuminated by the constant glow of fluorescent lights, the steady beeping of machines a background to her footsteps as she moved from room to room, checking on patients who often reached for her hand in the dark, their eyes searching for comfort in a world that had become uncertain and fragile. Her hands had learned the routine of adjusting blankets, of checking IV lines, of lifting tired bodies with care. the rhythm of the work a familiarity that soothed her in the way it always had, even as her knees ached and her back protested with each long hour. They called her Mama Grace at the hospital, a name that had followed her from the first year she started, a name that felt both comforting and heavy. It reminded her of who she had always been, of the role she had stepped into without question when Michael was born, of the care she gave to everyone, even when her own needs were left waiting quietly in the background. Sometimes, when she sat in the small break room during her shift, sipping coffee from a paper cup, she would think of Michael as a baby, the way he would curl into her chest, his small hands gripping the fabric of her uniform as if it were the only safety he knew. She remembered staying up with him during his fevers, placing cool claws on his forehead, rocking him slowly in the chair that still sat in the corner of her bedroom, the wood worn smooth by years of holding him through restless nights. On the days she was home, the hours passed slowly, marked by small tasks that she had made into routines, wiping down the counters, folding laundry, sweeping the porch, watering the stubborn flower bed, checking the mailbox, even though she no longer expected letters that carried good news. She would sit by the window in the evenings, the lamp casting a warm glow across the room as she held her cup of tea, watching the shadows stretch across the floor, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into the night. Children's laughter would drift through the open window, fading as the streetlights flickered on, and she would close her eyes, letting the memories of Michael's laughter wash over her, remembering the way he would run barefoot through the small yard, the way he would call for her to watch him, to see him, to witness the small victories of his childhood. Grace's neighbor, Miss Loretta, often invited her over for tea, waving from her porch with a smile that was always bright, her hands always busy with the small garden that lined her steps. Grace would smile back, waving politely, calling out promises of next time and soon, but she rarely found herself crossing the street. It was not that she disliked Loretta's company, it was simply that the effort to fill the silence with conversation often felt too heavy, the energy required to smile and nod draining in a way that her work never was. She would watch Loretta tend to her flowers, the bright blooms reaching for the sun, and feel a pang of something she could not quite name, something that hovered between loneliness and longing, a quiet recognition that life was passing by outside her window while she remained in place. On one of those mornings, as Grace was folding a towel with deliberate care, smoothing the edges before placing it in the linen closet, the phone rang, its sharp sound cutting through the quiet of the house. She let it ring once, twice, before setting the towel aside and walking to the phone, her hand hovering for a moment before she picked it up, pressing it to her ear with a cautious hope she did not allow herself to acknowledge. Michael's voice came through the line, bright and quick, his words tumbling over each other as he told her he had news, that he was getting married, that her baby boy was ready to start a new chapter of his life. Grace closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her, her heart lifting in a way it had not in so long, a warmth spreading through her as she imagined the wedding, the celebration, the family gathering together in a way they had not in years. She listened to Michael's excitement, the way his voice lifted when he spoke about the plans, about the woman he loved, about the life they were building. She asked him questions, simple ones, careful not to intrude, not to overwhelm him with her joy, holding back the flood of memories and dreams that threatened to spill from her lips. When the call ended, when the quiet returned to the house, Grace stood for a moment with the phone still in her hand, her eyes closed, a small smile on her lips as she let herself hope, truly hope, that this wedding might bring them closer again, that it might be the moment she returned to the place she had always believed she belonged, by her son's side, sharing in his happiness, part of his life in a way that mattered. That evening, Grace moved through the house with a new lightness, her steps quieter but filled with purpose as she prepared her small dinner, as she washed the dishes, as she set the kettle for tea. She walked into the living room, pausing by the wall of photographs, letting her fingers brush over the frames, tracing the images of Michael as a child, as a young man, as the boy she had raised with every ounce of strength she had. She whispered a quiet promise to the empty room, a promise that she would be there, that she would stand proudly at his wedding, that she would wear her best dress, that she would bring the banana bread he loved so much, that she would show him, without words, how deeply she loved him and how ready she was to celebrate the life he was building. As the night settled over the house, as the shadows grew longer, and the sounds of the neighborhood faded into the soft hum of distant traffic, Grace prepared for bed, folding back the covers, smoothing the sheets before slipping under them, her eyes lifting to the ceiling as she listened to the soft creaks of the house around her. She closed her eyes, letting the memories of the day wash over her, letting herself feel the quiet joy that had taken root in her chest, a joy that whispered of hope and belonging, of family and love, of the simple, profound wish to be seen and needed by the child she had given everything to raise. And as sleep gently pulled her into dreams, Grace held on to that hope, believing that the days ahead would bring her closer to the son she loved, believing that the wedding would be the beginning of something beautiful, believing that in the quiet of her small house, in the life she had built with her own hands, there was still space for joy, for love, and for the soft, enduring promise of family. The morning after Michael's call, Grace rose before the dawn once again, but this time there was a brightness in her chest that felt almost like a secret, a tiny bloom of hope that stretched quietly within her ribs as she moved through the soft light of the kitchen. The kettle hummed on the stove, and she stood in her robe, steam brushing against her face as she closed her eyes and let the warmth sink into her skin. She opened the small window over the sink, letting in the cool Georgia morning, the scent of wet earth and the distant call of birds folding softly into the kitchen's familiar air. She took her coffee to the table, the same spot she sat every morning, but today her eyes moved over the paper without seeing it, her thoughts elsewhere as she pictured Michael's wedding. She imagined the way the hall might look, filled with flowers and music, people dressed in their best clothes, laughter echoing against the walls as Michael and his bride stood together, young and full of hope. Grace's fingers curled around the warm mug, pressing it close to her chest as she allowed herself to imagine being there, present and proud, watching him step into this new chapter of his life, her heart quietly whispering that maybe, just maybe, it would also be a new chapter for her, too. After breakfast, she opened the narrow closet by the bedroom, pulling down a box she had not touched in years. The pink dress lay inside, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, its soft pleats pressed into place from the last time she had cleaned and folded it with care. She laid it out on the bed, smoothing the fabric with her hands, feeling the gentle slide of the material beneath her fingers. She had bought it years ago, back when Michael had been in college, saving it for a special occasion she could not yet name, but always hoped would come. It was a soft, warm pink, not too bright, with a waist that fell gently and sleeves that touched the curve of her arms, in a way that made her feel elegant, seen. She imagined herself wearing it at the wedding, her hair neatly pinned, a soft lipstick that would not draw too much attention but would make her feel complete. She checked the hem, noticing a small thread coming loose near the bottom, and she fetched her sewing kit from the kitchen drawer, sitting by the window as the morning light grew brighter, threading the needle carefully with eyes that had begun to tire over the years but still found their way through the small loop. The needle moved in and out of the fabric with a steady rhythm, her hands remembering the motions they had learned from her mother, who had once sat in the same light, sewing small dresses for Grace when she was a child. Grace's mother had always believed in presenting yourself with care, in maintaining dignity even when the world did not notice, and as Grace's needle moved, she felt her mother's presence in the room, a quiet, steady encouragement that guided her fingers. When the hem was secure, she pressed the dress with the old iron that hissed and steamed, smoothing every crease until it fell just right. She hung it on the back of the bedroom door, stepping back to look at it, letting herself feel the anticipation of wearing it, of stepping into a room where Michael would see her, where he would know that she had come to celebrate him, that she was there as she had always been, quietly supporting him through every change and milestone. Later that day, Grace took the bus into town, her purse held tightly against her side, the hum of the engine a soft reminder of how long it had been since she had ventured beyond her usual routes of the grocery store, the church, the hospital. The streets were busy with people moving in and out of stores, children tugging at their parents' hands, teenagers laughing loudly as they passed in small groups. Grace stepped off the bus carefully, adjusting her bag on her shoulder, and walked to the small fabric store near the corner of the street, its windows filled with bolts of colorful cloth, spools of ribbon, and small baskets of buttons that caught the light. Inside, the store smelled of cotton and the faint scent of lavender from the sachets near the register, a comforting scent that made Grace's shoulders ease as she moved through the aisles, her fingers brushing against the fabrics as she considered what she might choose. She wanted to make something for Michael and his new wife, something that would be a part of their new home, a piece of her love quietly stitched into their future. She found a bolt of soft fabric with a delicate pattern, flowers small enough not to overwhelm, a gentle blue that reminded her of the sky on clear mornings when the world felt possible. She chose matching thread and a small length of ribbon to finish the edges, her mind already envisioning the tablecloth she would sew, imagining it spread across their kitchen table, holding plates and cups, the small moments of their new life built on top of the fabric she had prepared with care. At home, she washed the fabric gently, hanging it over the back porch rail to dry in the warm breeze, the cloth fluttering slightly as the wind moved through it, the sun catching the soft colors and making them glow. She set up her sewing machine on the kitchen table, the hum of the needle a comforting sound as she worked, guiding the fabric through, folding and pressing the seams, her hands moving with practiced precision as the hours slipped by. She thought of Michael with each stitch, remembering the way he would sit at the table doing his homework, asking her for help with his math, the way he would push his books aside and smile at her, telling her about his dreams, about the places he wanted to see, the life he wanted to live. The tablecloth grew beneath her hands, piece by piece, the edges carefully finished, the ribbon stitched along the borders with a steady, even line. She folded it neatly when it was done, pressing it carefully and wrapping it in tissue paper, tying it with the ribbon she had chosen, holding it for a moment against her chest before placing it in a small box she would bring to the wedding. It felt like a part of her, a quiet gift of all the mornings and evenings she had spent building a life for Michael, a symbol of her hope that he would feel her presence in his new life, that he would know she was with him, even in the smallest moments. In the evenings, Grace would sit by the window as the light faded, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the room as she prepared the ingredients for the banana bread Michael loved so much. She mashed the ripe bananas in a bowl, the sweet scent filling the kitchen as she mixed in the flour, the sugar, the eggs, her movements deliberate and careful. She poured the batter into the loaf pan, sliding it into the oven, the warmth of the heat brushing against her face as she closed the door and set the timer. She cleaned the counter as it baked, the smell wrapping around her, a reminder of mornings when Michael would wake early just to have a warm slice before school, his eyes sleepy but bright as he thanked her, his small hands reaching for hers before he ran out the door. When the bread was done, she let it cool before wrapping it in wax paper, placing it gently into a tin she had kept for years, the lid fitting snugly as she pressed it down, her fingers resting on the top for a moment before she placed it on the counter. She would bring it to the rehearsal dinner, she decided, a small piece of home for Michael to share with his new family, a taste of the mornings they had shared, a reminder that she was there, that she still knew how to care for him, even if the world was changing around them. At church, Grace shared her news quietly with the women she knew, their faces lighting up with genuine happiness as they hugged her, their voices warm as they offered congratulations and blessings for Michael and his bride. They spoke of their own children's weddings, of the small moments that had stayed with them, of the way the world shifted when they watched their children step into their new lives. Grace listened, nodding, her heart lifting with each story, feeling a part of something larger than herself, connected to the generations of mothers who had stood where she was standing now, preparing to let go, to trust that the love they had given would carry forward into a future they might not fully see. At night, when the house grew quiet, Grace would sit by her bed holding the small Bible that had belonged to her mother, the worn leather soft under her fingers as she whispered prayers for Michael, for his happiness, for his safety, for the strength to let him step into his new life with the confidence that she would be all right, that she would find her place in the world that was growing beyond the walls of her small house. She felt the fear sometimes, the quiet voice that asked what her life would be when he was truly gone into his own future, when the calls came less frequently, when the visits were replaced by quick messages and short updates. She felt the fear, but she did not let it grow, choosing instead to hold on to the hope that this wedding would be a moment of connection, a reminder that family was not a thing that ended, but something that transformed and continued, reaching across distances with the strength of the love that had built it. As she prepared herself each day, folding clothes, cleaning the house, setting aside the small box with the tablecloth and the tin of banana bread, Grace felt the days move with a gentle anticipation, each moment a step closer to the wedding, each breath a quiet promise that she would be there, that she would stand proudly, wearing her pink dress, carrying the love she had spent a lifetime given, ready to witness the beginning of Michael's new life, while finding the courage to believe that her own life still held space for joy, for love, and for the quiet, steady presence of hope. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky the color of pearl, the early light soft across the quiet streets as Grace stood by her window, holding the pink dress up against her body, her eyes searching the reflection for a sign of the young woman she once was when she had first dreamed of wearing something beautiful to a moment that mattered. The soft pleats fell gently around her, the color warming her dark skin, reminding her of spring mornings when she would take Michael out to the park, his small hand clutching hers, the sound of his laughter carrying across the playground like a promise of days that would never end. She pinned her hair carefully, using the small comb with the faded pearl edge that her mother had once given her, the simple elegance a reminder that dignity was a quiet thing, held not in what others saw, but in what she carried within herself. She checked the clock, the steady ticking a companion in the silence, and she moved through the house with practiced hands, tidying the kitchen, placing the tin of banana bread into a bag, along with the box that held the hand-sewn tablecloth. She touched the fabric one last time before closing the box, pressing her fingers into the soft folds as if she could send a piece of herself with it, something that Michael and his wife might feel each morning when they sat down for breakfast, the small moments of their new life held within the quiet labor of her hands. She slipped into her coat, the one she had cleaned and pressed, the sleeves freshly hemmed, and stepped out into the morning, the air cool against her face, the promise of the day carrying her steps as she made her way to the bus stop, her eyes lifted to the soft clouds that drifted above the trees. The bus was nearly empty, the soft rumble of the engine a comfort as she sat near the window, holding the bag close to her side, watching the city move past in flashes of familiar streets and strangers' faces, the quiet hum of tires on pavement, a rhythm that matched the steady beat of her heart. She thought of Michael as a boy, how he would press his face to the window on bus rides, his eyes wide with wonder at the world, asking questions about the people they passed, the places they might go someday. She remembered the way he would lean into her side, resting his head against her arm, the trust in his small body, a warmth that had stayed with her long after he had grown taller than she was, after he had begun to move through the world on his own, the boy she had raised slipping into the man who now stood ready to begin his own family. The bus pulled up in front of the venue, a large building of glass and wood that rose up beside a small lake, the water still and reflecting the gray sky above. Grace stepped down carefully, adjusting her coat, the pink dress peeking out as she walked up the steps, her shoes clicking softly against the polished stone. The entrance was decorated with flowers, soft white blooms and green leaves that draped around the doors, the scent gentle in the cool air, a promise of beauty and celebration that caught at her chest as she paused for a moment before stepping inside. Inside, the hall was filled with the quiet buzz of people arriving, voices blending into the soft strains of music that played from hidden speakers, the warm glow of lights reflecting off the glass walls that opened up to the lake beyond. Grace looked around, searching for Michael, her eyes moving over groups of people laughing, greeting each other with hugs, the easy familiarity of family and friends coming together to celebrate. She saw faces she did not know, people dressed in careful elegance, their voices rising in laughter as they exchanged stories, their hands holding glasses of sparkling wine that caught the light as they moved. A young woman at the front desk smiled brightly at Grace, handing her a small name tag with her name printed neatly. Grace Wilson, the letters stark against the white background. There was no mention of mother of the groom, no small ribbon like the ones she saw pinned to others' tags, indicating father of the bride, or sister of the bride, or best friend. Grace held the tag for a moment, the plastic warm in her hand, before she pinned it to her coat, pressing it firmly into place as she lifted her chin, reminding herself that she belonged here, that she had every right to stand in this space and witness her son's joy. She moved through the lobby, the polished floor reflecting the soft light, her eyes scanning the clusters of people, catching glimpses of Michael as he moved from one group to another, his smile bright, his laughter carrying across the space in a way that made her heart swell and ache all at once. He looked handsome in his suit, his posture confident, his gestures quick and warm as he greeted guests, shaking hands, embracing family members she did not recognize. Grace waited, standing quietly to the side, hoping for a moment when his eyes would meet hers, when he would see her standing there, her pink dress carefully pressed, the gift she had made with love waiting in her bag, the banana bread ready to be shared. A young man with a headset and a clipboard approached her, his smile polite but distracted as he gestured toward a table near the back of the room, his words quick as he explained the seating arrangements, his hand lightly touching her arm as he guided her to a place far from the front, near the corner where the light from the windows was softer, where the laughter of the main groups reached only as a distant murmur. Grace sat down carefully, placing her bag on the floor beside her, folding her hands in her lap as she looked around the table at the strangers who filled the seats, their conversations drifting over her as they spoke about work trips and vacation plans, about new houses and renovations, their words a gentle reminder of a life she did not know, of a world she was not part of. The table had a small sign that simply read guest, while others closer to the center of the room bore signs that read groom's family, bride's family, close friends. Grace felt the weight of the word pressing against her as she sat, her eyes moving to the center of the room where Michael stood, surrounded by people, his smile bright as he leaned toward a woman Grace assumed was his bride, the two of them sharing a soft moment before turning back to the group, laughter spilling around them as they moved together through the gathering. Grace adjusted the hem of her dress, smoothing the fabric over her knees as she listened to the conversations around her, the polite questions that occasionally drifted her way, asking where she was from, how she knew the couple, small pleasantries that she answered with quiet patience, her voice steady even as her mind wandered to the empty chair beside Michael, to the place she had imagined herself standing, close enough to see the details of his expression, to hear the softness of his voice when he spoke, to feel that she was truly there with him on this day that marked the beginning of his new life. The music shifted, growing softer as the lights dimmed slightly, and people began to take their seats for the meal. Grace noticed the way the waiters moved gracefully through the room, carrying trays of small, elegant dishes, the scents unfamiliar but pleasant as plates were placed in front of each guest. The chicken on her plate was tender but dry, the vegetables arranged in careful patterns that felt more like decoration than food, the buttered roll on the side remaining untouched as she watched the people around her eat and laugh, their conversations weaving around her as she nodded politely, lifting her fork without truly tasting the food. At the front of the room, toast began, the microphone passing from hand to hand as people stood to share stories of the couple, their voices filled with laughter and love, memories of college days and childhood adventures, small jokes that drew laughter from the crowd, the sound rising and falling like a gentle wave that never quite reached where Grace sat. She waited, her hands folding and unfolding the napkin in her lap, hoping for a moment when Michael might look her way, when he might catch her eye and smile, acknowledging her presence with a nod, a wave, a simple glance that would remind her that she was seen. Someone asked when the groom's mother might speak, their voice light, a joke that drew a laugh from the bride as she replied, "Maybe later," before the microphone passed to the next speaker, the moment slipping away as easily as it had come, leaving Grace sitting in the soft glow of the lights, her heart heavy with the quiet understanding that the moment would not come, that her voice would not be a part of the chorus of stories and laughter that filled the room. Dessert arrived, small lemon tarts arranged on delicate plates, the bright yellow a sharp contrast to the white china. Grace took a bite, the tartness blooming on her tongue, the sweetness hidden beneath the sharp edge, a taste that reminded her of mornings when she would slice lemons for tea, the scent filling the kitchen as she prepared breakfast for Michael before school. She set the fork down after one bite, the taste lingering as she watched Michael dance with his bride, the two of them moving easily together, their smiles bright, their hands linked in a promise that was theirs alone. Grace watched as Michael danced with the bride's mother, with aunts and cousins, with friends who laughed and clapped as they moved to the music. She sat quietly, fixing the hem of her dress where it had caught on the edge of her chair, her hands smoothing the fabric again and again, the motion a comfort as she kept her eyes on Michael, waiting for the moment he might look for her, might remember the mother who had raised him, who had given him the foundation on which he now stood. The photographer moved through the room, his camera capturing moments of laughter and joy, the flash catching the light as he paused near Grace's table, his eyes moving past her before he turned away. The camera never lifting to capture the quiet woman in the pink dress who sat with her hands folded in her lap, the woman who had come with a gift wrapped in tissue paper, with banana bread carefully packed, with a heart full of hope that today might be the day she found her place again in her son's life. As the evening drew to a close, the music softening into a gentle background, people began to rise from their seats, embracing, gathering their coats, their laughter echoing as they moved toward the exits. Grace sat for a moment longer, folding her napkin carefully, slipping it under the rim of her glass before she stood, lifting her bag from the floor, the weight of it a reminder of the gift she had brought, the gift that remained unopened, unacknowledged, a silent offering left in the quiet space between what she had hoped for and what had come to pass. She walked through the hall, her steps steady as she moved toward the door, the soft air of the evening brushing against her face as she stepped outside, the sky now dark and filled with stars that glimmered above the still lake. She did not look back as she walked toward the bus stop, her hands holding the bag close to her side. Her eyes lifted to the sky as she let the cool air wash over her, breathing in the quiet of the night as she stepped onto the bus, finding a seat near the window, resting her head lightly against the glass as the city lights moved past in gentle blurs of gold and white. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engine soothe the ache that had settled in her chest, letting herself feel the fullness of the day, the weight of what she had carried and what she had left behind. She thought of Michael, of the way he had laughed, of the way he had moved through the room with confidence and joy, and she let herself feel the pride that rose quietly within her, even as the soft ache of distance settled alongside it. A reminder that love did not always look the way she had imagined, that sometimes it was quiet and distant, a presence that lingered even when it was not seen. As the bus turned onto her street, the familiar shapes of the houses welcoming her back, Grace gathered her bag, standing as the bus slowed to a stop, stepping down onto the sidewalk with a quiet breath as she walked toward her home, the lights in the windows welcoming her into the soft, steady quiet that she had built with her own hands. She opened the door, stepping inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around her as she set the bag down gently, removing her coat, hanging it carefully before she stood in the middle of the room, letting the quiet settle around her, letting herself feel the fullness of the day that had passed. And in that quiet, Grace allowed herself a moment to hope, to believe that even in the spaces where she felt unseen, her love remained, a quiet, enduring presence that would carry forward, a promise that she would continue to stand, to care, to be present, even when the world moved on around her, even when the spaces she hoped to fill remained empty. She turned off the light, stepping into the soft darkness of the house, her steps steady as she moved toward her room, the pink dress brushing against her legs as she walked, a reminder of the hope she carried, of the quiet love that remained, even in the silence. Grace awoke to the pale dawn pressing gently against her window, the light slipping between the curtains in thin lines that fell across the floor in quiet promise of a new day, though the heaviness in her chest reminded her that the wedding had passed, leaving behind a silence more precise than before. She sat on the edge of her bed, the floor cool beneath her feet, and allowed herself a moment to listen to the sounds of the house breathing around her, the creak of the wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock that seemed louder in the hush that followed the emptiness she had brought home with her. She moved quietly through the morning, folding her robe over the back of the chair, smoothing her bed with careful hands, preparing herself for the day as she always did, though the motions felt slower, deliberate in their purpose as she tried to understand the shape of the quiet that followed her. In the kitchen, she prepared her coffee, the scent familiar and warm, filling the small space with comfort as she stood by the window and looked out over the yard. The stubborn patch of earth where she had tried to grow tulips remained bare, the dirt dry beneath the light breeze that ruffled the few green weeds that had managed to push through the hardened surface. She remembered how she had watered that patch, even when nothing grew, believing that the simple act of care would one day bring color back into the small space outside her window. It struck her then, the quiet parallel between the soil and her hope, how easily she had believed in the promise of something growing simply because she wanted it to. The memory of the wedding returned as she sipped her coffee, the taste bitter on her tongue as she remembered sitting at the table near the back, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses distant as she waited for Michael to find her, to see her, to acknowledge her presence in a room that had felt so far away despite her being there. She set her cup down, her hand resting on the countertop as she closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the coffee seep through her, reminding herself that she had been there, that she had shown up, that she had done what she had promised herself she would do, even if the acknowledgement she hoped for had not come. It was mid-morning when the phone rang, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet, and Grace paused before answering, her hand hovering over the receiver as if preparing herself for the voice on the other end. Michael's voice came through, bright and quick, as if he had rehearsed the words before dialing her number, the edges of his excitement tempered by something careful that she could not quite name. He asked how she was, how she had been feeling since the wedding, and Grace answered with calm politeness, her voice steady as she reassured him that she was well, that she had enjoyed the wedding, that it had been beautiful. Then came the invitation, slipped into the conversation as if it were a casual thought, a suggestion of having her over for dinner, just the two of them, an evening to talk and spend time together. Grace felt a warmth rise in her chest at the thought, the possibility of sitting across from Michael, sharing a meal, speaking with him without the noise of a room filled with strangers. She accepted the invitation with a soft yes. The word of promise she held on to as she hung up the phone, the dial tone humming in her ear for a moment before she replaced the receiver and stood in the kitchen, her hand resting lightly on the counter as she allowed herself to feel the quiet joy that came with the hope that this dinner might be the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she would feel close to him again. The rest of the day passed in gentle preparation, the hours marked by the small, familiar tasks that Grace moved through with quiet purpose. She chose her clothes carefully, deciding on a cardigan she had kept since the days when Michael was young, the fabric soft with age, the small pearl buttons a reminder of mornings when she would dress for work while he ate breakfast at the table, his small voice telling her that she looked pretty, that she smelled like soap and cinnamon, words that had stayed with her long after he had stopped saying them. She baked a batch of oatmeal cookies, the scent filling the house as the afternoon light moved across the walls, the warmth of the oven wrapping around her as she moved quietly, placing the cookies in neat rows on the tray before sliding them into the oven. When the cookies were done, she let them cool before wrapping them in foil, placing them carefully in a tin she lined with a soft cloth, the act of preparation filling her with a sense of purpose that calmed the small nerves that had begun to flutter in her chest. She placed the tin in a bag by the door, checking her reflection one last time in the hallway mirror, smoothing her cardigan over her shoulders, pressing her hair into place, allowing herself a small smile as she turned off the lights and stepped outside, locking the door behind her as she walked to her car, the air cool against her skin as the sky began to turn the soft colors of dusk. The drive to Michael's house was quiet, the roads nearly empty, the soft hum of the tires on the pavement a gentle reminder of the countless drives she had made over the years, taking Michael to school, to practice, to the small moments of his childhood that she had held close, believing they would always be enough to keep them close. She drove past familiar landmarks, the small diner where they had shared breakfast on his first day of high school, the park where he had learned to ride his bike, the grocery store where he would help her carry bags, his small hands gripping the handles with determined focus, his voice bright as he told her about his dreams. Michael's new house stood on a quiet street, the lawns trimmed neatly, the houses lined in careful rows, each with matching mailboxes and tidy porches that spoke of order and quiet lives. She parked in front of the house, turning off the engine, sitting for a moment as she looked at the house, the windows glowing softly with warm light, the curtains drawn back to reveal a glimpse of the living room, the edges of new furniture, the careful arrangement of a life newly started. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her feet as she walked up the path, a small tin of cookies held in her hands as she climbed the steps to the porch. Michael opened the door quickly, his smile bright, his eyes warm as he stepped back to let her in. The quick embrace he gave her brief, his hands barely touching her shoulders before he turned and gestured for her to follow him inside. The house smelled of something clean, the faint scent of garlic and herbs drifting from the kitchen, though Grace noticed that there were no sounds of pots clanging, no bubbling of a simmering sauce, no warmth of an oven heating the room as she stepped inside. The living room was neat, the furniture new, the colors soft and neutral, the kind of careful design that spoke of planning, of decisions made to create a specific image, a life curated to appear welcoming. She followed Michael to the dining area, a small table set for two, plates and glasses neatly arranged, a bottle of wine uncorked and waiting, the soft light of a lamp casting a gentle glow over the space. Grace placed the tin of cookies on the counter, her hands lingering on the lid for a moment before she turned back to Michael, who was watching her with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. They spoke for a few moments, the conversation light, touching on small details of the wedding, the plans Michael and his wife had for their honeymoon, the new job he had started, the small updates that filled the space between them as they sat down at the table. Then, as the conversation lulled, Michael reached for a small stack of papers that had been placed beside his plate, the edges neatly aligned, a pen resting diagonally across the top page, the blue ink cap removed, ready. He slid the stack across the table toward her, his voice calm as he began to explain, the words coming in a practiced rhythm as he spoke of peace of mind, of making things easier, of being prepared in case something ever happened. Grace listened, her eyes moving over his face, watching the way his mouth formed the words, the way his eyes shifted to the papers, then back to her, the careful neutrality in his tone, unable to mask the tension that hovered just beneath the surface. She reached for the papers, lifting the top page, her eyes scanning the words that were thick with legal language, the phrases carefully structured to sound protective, reassuring, a promise of care wrapped in the language of control. Durable power of attorney, financial authority, real estate management, immediate effect, no expiration. The words pressed into her chest as she read them, her hands holding the pages as if they might crumble under the weight of what they represented, the quiet realization settling over her that this dinner was not about closeness, not about reconnecting, but about a transaction, a request for her to surrender the independence she had fought to maintain, offered under the gentle guise of concern. Michael's voice continued, his explanations filling the space between them, the words distant as Grace lowered the papers, placing them back on the table, her hand resting on top of them as she looked at her son, really looked at him, seeing the man he had become, the lines of worry around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, the practiced politeness that slipped through his gestures. She felt a sadness rise within her, a quiet grief that settled in her bones as she realized that the boy who had once reached for her hand, who had once trusted her to guide him through the uncertainties of childhood, now saw her as something to be managed, a responsibility to be handled efficiently, her life reduced to a set of documents and signatures. She smiled softly, lifting her hand from the papers, telling him she would take them home, that she would read them carefully, her voice calm, steady, refusing to let the heaviness she felt seep into the space between them. Michael nodded, his relief visible as he reached for his wine, taking a sip as he looked at her, his eyes softening as if he believed the hardest part was done, as if he believed that the papers would soon return, signed and complete. The final piece of a plan that would give him the control he sought, the assurance he believed he needed. They spoke of nothing important after that, the conversation drifting to the weather, to the small details of the neighborhood, to a television show Michael mentioned in passing, the soft clink of the glasses and the muted sounds of the house filling the spaces between their words. Grace sat quietly, her hands resting on the table, her fingers gently tracing the grain of the wood as she listened, allowing herself to feel the shape of the moment, to understand the truth of what was being asked of her, to recognize the quiet strength she would need to hold on to as she stepped back into her own life, choosing to protect the independence she had built, the dignity she had maintained, the quiet promise she had made to herself to never surrender her voice. When the evening ended, Michael hugged her again, the embrace brief, careful, as he walked her to the door, the night air cool against her face as she stepped outside, the stars bright above the quiet street. She stood for a moment on the porch, looking back at her son as he smiled, his hand lifting in a small wave before he closed the door, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silence as Grace turned and walked back to her car, the tin of cookies still in the kitchen, unopened, untouched, a small piece of herself left behind in a house that felt more like a stranger's than a home. As she drove home, the roads empty, the lights of the city distant, Grace felt the weight of the evening settle over her, the soft, unyielding truth that love did not always protect against the quiet erosion of trust, that even the deepest care could become a shadow of expectation, that sometimes the greatest act of love was the one that protected herself, that chose to preserve the quiet dignity she had earned through a lifetime of giving, of caring, of standing quietly in the spaces where she was needed, even when she was unseen. She parked in front of her house, sitting in the car for a moment before turning off the engine, the night pressing softly against the windows as she looked at the small home she had built, the light in the window waiting for her, the warmth of the familiar wrapping around her as she stepped out and walked up the path, unlocking the door, stepping inside, and letting the quiet embrace her as she closed the door behind her. The promise of the night reminding her that she was still here, still standing, still herself, choosing, always, to protect the life she had built with her own hands. The morning after the dinner at Michael's new home, Grace woke to a heaviness that settled deep in her chest, the air in the room unmoving, heavy as if even the small breath of dawn could not stir it. She lay in bed, eyes open to the slow crawl of light across the ceiling, feeling the quiet press against her in a way it hadn't before, a silent reminder of the papers she had brought home, now sitting on the kitchen table like a presence she could not ignore. The previous evening came back to her in pieces, the polite conversation, the careful explanations, the stack of documents passed across the table with a pen ready, the soft request disguised as concern, the realization that her son saw her not as a mother to be cherished, but as a task to be managed. Grace rose slowly, the chill of the floor against her feet grounding her as she moved through the small motions of the morning, folding back the covers, straightening the pillow, smoothing her nightgown before changing into her day clothes with the deliberate care that had always been a part of her. She stepped into the kitchen, the smell of coffee already drifting as it brewed, the gentle drip and hiss of the machine reminding her of the quiet rituals she had built to keep herself steady, to remind herself that she was here, alive, capable, despite the slow, quiet grief that had found its way into the corners of her home. The stack of papers waited for her on the table, the top page slightly curled at the corner, the pen resting beside it like an accusation, its blue ink cap off, waiting for her to pick it up, to sign away the control she had held tightly for so long. She sat down, her hands wrapping around her coffee mug, the warmth seeping into her skin as she stared at the words she had already read, words that promised care and protection, words that also whispered of surrender, of the slow erasure of her voice, her choice, her dignity. She pushed the papers aside after a moment, rising from the table as she moved to the window, looking out over the small yard, the dry patch of earth where the tulips had never bloomed, the brittle stalks of last year's attempts still there, reminding her of her persistence, of her quiet hope that life could still find its way through even the hardest soil. She remembered the way Michael had looked at her the night before, the careful politeness in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders as he spoke of responsibility and planning, the words chosen carefully to sound like love, to sound like concern, but ringing hollow against the truth she had felt in her bones. She spent the day moving through the house, cleaning the small spaces that did not need cleaning, dusting the shelves where her books sat in neat rows, wiping down the kitchen counters until they shone, folding and refolding the towels in the linen closet until the edges aligned perfectly. It was a quiet rebellion, a way to remind herself that this was her space, her life, that she was still in control of these small pieces, even as the larger question of what she would do with the papers lingered like a shadow in the corner of every room. In the afternoon, she decided to search for an old quilt she had meant to mend, one of the few things left from her mother, tucked away in the basement among boxes that had not been opened in years. The air in the basement was cool, the scent of old wood and earth rising as she descended the steps, her knees aching with each careful movement. She moved boxes aside, the soft scrape of cardboard against the concrete floor loud in the quiet, until she found the box she was looking for, a faded label on the side written in her own hand, Mother's Things. She opened the box slowly, the cardboard soft with age, the flaps lifting to reveal the neatly folded quilt on top, the fabric worn thin in places, the patches of color still bright where her mother's careful hands had stitched them in. She lifted the quilt, holding it to her chest for a moment before setting it aside, her hands moving through the layers beneath it. The small keepsakes her mother had kept, a comb with missing teeth, a pair of glasses, a small Bible with pages thin as breath, marked with the notes and prayers her mother had written in the margins. At the bottom of the box was a bundle of letters, tied together with a piece of frayed ribbon, the paper yellowed at the edges, the handwriting unmistakable, strong and slanted, the ink faded but clear. Grace sat back on her heels, the weight of the letters in her hands heavy with memory, with the presence of the woman who had shaped her, who had loved her in the only ways she knew how, in the hard lessons and the quiet moments of care that Grace had not always understood as love. She carried the letters upstairs, the box left behind in the basement as she settled into the chair by the window, the light falling across her lap as she untied the ribbon, the letters opening like a door into a past she had not visited in so long. Her mother's words spoke to her from across the years, stories of days when Grace was small, of the struggles her mother faced alone, of the choices she made to protect them both, of the fears she had never voiced, the worries that pressed on her even as she moved through the days with steady hands and a quiet strength. Grace read each letter slowly, letting the words sink into her, the steady rhythm of her mother's handwriting reminding her of the lessons she had learned at her feet, lessons about dignity, about the importance of standing firm, about the right to say no, even to those you love, even when it is the hardest thing to do. One letter caught her, a short note written in the shaky hand of her mother's later years, the words simple and direct. You have the right to your own life, Grace. Even love cannot demand that you give yourself away. She held the letter in her hands, her eyes closing as she felt the truth of the words settle into her, the quiet strength of her mother's voice reminding her that what was being asked of her was not love, but convenience, that her worth was not measured by her willingness to surrender her life, her choices, her dignity, for the comfort of others, even her own child. The tears came then, soft and quiet, slipping down her cheeks as she sat in the fading light, the quilt over her legs, the letters in her lap, the house silent around her as she allowed herself to feel the grief of what she had lost, the disappointment of what she had hoped for, and the quiet resolve that began to grow in the space where the sorrow had settled. As the evening light turned to darkness, Grace stood, folding the letters carefully, placing them back into the bundle, tying the ribbon around them once more before setting them on the small table beside her chair. She moved to the kitchen, the papers still there on the table, waiting. But now she looked at them with clear eyes, the decision forming in her mind, quiet but firm, a promise to herself that she would not sign them, that she would not surrender the life she had built, the independence she had maintained, the dignity she had earned through years of hard work and quiet perseverance. She made herself a cup of tea, the warmth of it comforting as she stood by the window, looking out into the night, the stars bright above the dark shapes of the trees, the quiet of the neighborhood wrapping around her like a blanket as she breathed deeply, letting the strength she had found in her mother's words settle into her bones. She would protect herself, she decided. She would find the way to ensure that her life remained hers, that the choices she made would be her own, that the love she had given so freely would not be used as leverage against her, that her son would see her not as a burden, but as the woman she was, strong and steady, deserving of respect. The next morning, she found the number of her old friend Clara, a woman she had known for years, a retired lawyer whose sharp mind had always been tempered with kindness, with an understanding of the complexities of life and the quiet battles women like Grace had fought their entire lives. She dialed the number, her fingers steady on the buttons, her breath calm as she waited for the line to connect. The soft click as Clara's voice came through, warm and familiar, bringing with it the comfort of knowing that she was not alone, that she would find the way forward, that she would protect the life she had built. They spoke quietly, the conversation filled with the practical details of what Grace needed to do, of the steps she would take to protect her assets, her home, her independence, to ensure that her son's intentions, whether born of care or convenience, would not strip her of the control she had earned, of the life she had fought to maintain. When the call ended, Grace felt a quiet certainty settle into her, a resolve that steadied her as she moved through the day. The papers still on the kitchen table, now a reminder, not of what she might lose, but of what she would protect. That evening, she sat by the window, the quilt over her legs, the letters from her mother beside her, the stars above the quiet street reminding her that she was part of something larger, that the strength of the women who came before her lived in her, that she was allowed to choose herself, to say no, to stand firm in the face of expectations that would diminish her, that love did not mean surrender, that care did not mean control. And as the night deepened, Grace allowed herself to rest, the quiet around her no longer heavy with fear, but filled with the soft promise of the freedom she was reclaiming, the dignity she was protecting, the life she was choosing to live for herself on her own terms, with the quiet, steady strength that had always been her greatest gift. Grace awoke the next morning with a quiet clarity that settled into her bones, a certainty that had taken root in the silence of the previous night as she sat by the window beneath her mother's quilt, the old letters resting beside her like a promise she had made to herself. The house felt different that morning, not in its appearance but in the way Grace moved through it, the way she opened the curtains to let the light pour in, the way she set the kettle on the stove and folded her hands around her coffee mug, letting the warmth sink into her skin as she stood by the window, watching the dawn turn the sky from gray to pale blue. She saw the familiar shapes of the neighborhood slowly emerge in the growing light, the trees gently swaying with the morning breeze, the quiet hum of birds moving across the sky, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that she was not simply surviving the day, but choosing to live it. After breakfast, she sat down at the kitchen table where the papers Michael had given her still lay, the top page slightly curled, the pen resting beside them like a silent witness to the conversation that had taken place, to the careful words that had been offered as concern, but felt like something else entirely. She looked at them for a long moment, her eyes tracing the lines of text she had already read, her mind turning over the conversations she had shared with Clara the day before, the calm and confident voice of her friend reminding her of the steps she needed to take, the ways she could protect herself, the right she had to say no without guilt or apology. She gathered the papers and placed them in a folder, tucking it into her bag with steady hands, her movements deliberate, unhurried, filled with the quiet strength that had become her anchor. Grace dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy dress with small white flowers, the fabric soft against her skin, familiar and comforting. She pinned her hair back neatly, slipped on her low-heeled shoes, and draped her cardigan over her shoulders before taking up her bag and stepping out into the cool morning air. The sky was clear, the sunlight falling gently over the rooftops and lawns as she walked to her car, the engine starting with a soft rumble that seemed to echo the steady rhythm of her resolve. She drove through the quiet streets, the city slowly waking around her, the hum of traffic beginning to build as she moved toward Clara's small office on the edge of town, a space filled with books and the scent of coffee and lavender, a place that had always felt safe. Clara welcomed her with a warm hug, her sharp eyes softening as she looked at Grace, seeing the resolve in the lines of her face, the quiet dignity in the way she held herself. They sat together at the small wooden table near the window, the light falling across the surface where Clara spread out the papers Grace had brought, her pen moving quickly as she made notes, highlighting sections, explaining in clear and simple words what each clause meant, how it would affect Grace's life, how it would strip away the independence she had earned, the control she had maintained, the dignity she had carried with her through every year of her life. Grace listened, nodding, asking questions when she needed to, letting the information settle into her, each word from Clara strengthening the quiet certainty that she was making the right choice, that protecting herself was not an act of defiance but an act of love for the woman she was, for the life she had built. Together, they began the process of creating a trust that would secure Grace's home and assets, placing them under her control in a way that could not be undone by the well-meaning or misguided intentions of others, a structure that would protect her while allowing her to live her life on her terms. Clara explained each step with patience, her calm voice guiding Grace through the process, ensuring that every detail was clear, that every choice was made with intention, that Grace understood the power she was reclaiming with each signature she placed on the documents they prepared. Grace felt the weight lift from her shoulders as she signed the papers, her pen moving steadily across the lines, the ink drying quickly as each page was completed, each signature a small declaration that she would no longer be a silent participant in decisions about her own life. They talked quietly as they worked, Clara sharing stories of other women she had helped, women who had spent their lives giving, nurturing, caring, only to find themselves expected to give away the final pieces of themselves in the name of love, of family, of duty. Grace listened, the stories echoing in her heart, the familiarity of them reminding her that she was not alone, that her experiences were a part of a larger tapestry of women who had fought quietly for their dignity, for their independence, for the right to live their lives without apology. It comforted her to know she was not the first, and would not be the last, to stand in this place, to make this choice, to reclaim the parts of herself that had been slowly eroded by the expectations of others. When they finished, Clara placed the documents in a thick folder, securing it with a clip before handing it to Grace, her eyes meeting hers with a quiet pride that needed no words. Grace held the folder against her chest for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the significance of what it contained, the protection it offered, the freedom it represented. She thanked Clara, her voice steady, her gratitude clear, the bond between them strengthened by the shared understanding of what this day meant, of what Grace had chosen for herself. As she drove home, the sky had turned a deeper blue, the sun warm on her face through the window, the world around her moving with a quiet hum that felt in sync with the steady beat of her heart. She parked the car in her driveway, stepping out with the folder in her hand, walking up the path to her front door with a confidence she had not felt in years, unlocking the door and stepping inside, the familiar scent of her home wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. She placed the folder in the cabinet beneath the sink, tucking it behind a box of dishwasher pods, a place easy for her to reach but hidden from casual view, a quiet reminder that she was protected, that she had made the choice to secure her future, that she had taken the steps to ensure that her life remained hers. In the days that followed, Grace found herself moving through her home with a new sense of purpose, each room holding the quiet energy of her choice, Each small task she completed a reminder that she was living her life on her terms. She resumed her routine with a calm focus, tending to the small garden she had started in pots along the back porch, watering the herbs and the small flowers she had planted, watching them grow under her care, their quiet resilience reflecting her own. She found joy in the simple tasks, in the way the light moved across the floor in the afternoons, in the scent of the bread she baked, in the quiet moments of prayer she shared with herself as she sat by the window in the evenings, the stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. She began attending the women's group at the church again, sitting with the other women as they shared their stories, their laughter, their quiet moments of sorrow and hope. She listened, nodding, offering her own words when it felt right, finding comfort in the shared understanding that filled the room, in the strength that came from knowing she was part of something larger than herself, part of a community that saw her, that valued her, that recognized the quiet dignity she carried. They worked together on small projects for the church, baking bread for the soup kitchen, sewing quilts for new mothers, tending the flowers that lined the walkway, each task a small act of care, a small contribution that reminded Grace of the ways she could give without losing herself, of the ways she could share her strength without surrendering her independence. When Michael called a week later, his voice cautious, asking if she had had time to look over the papers, Grace felt a calm settle over her as she explained that she had chosen a different path, that she had made arrangements to protect herself, that her affairs were in order, and that there was no need for concern. She spoke with a quiet firmness, her words clear, her boundaries defined, and though there was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that spoke of his surprise, of his uncertainty, she did not fill it with explanations or apologies. She allowed the silence to be a quiet space where her choice could exist without justification, where her decision stood as it was, firm and unyielding. Michael's voice softened after a moment, and he spoke of other things, of work, of the small details of his days, of plans he and his wife were making for the future, and Grace listened, responding with interest, allowing the conversation to shift, to move forward without the weight of the expectations that had once pressed between them. When they ended the call, Grace felt a quiet relief, a sense of peace that settled into her, the knowledge that she had not lost her son, that she had simply reclaimed herself, that the love she had for him could exist alongside the boundaries she had set, that choosing herself did not mean abandoning him, but rather honoring the life she had built, the woman she had become. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Grace stood on her porch, the scent of the flowers she had planted drifting in the soft breeze, the quiet of the neighborhood wrapping around her as she breathed deeply, allowing herself to feel the fullness of the moment. She had chosen herself. She had protected her life, and in doing so, she had found a freedom she had not known she was missing, a quiet, steady strength that would carry her forward into the days to come, each step a reminder that she was worthy of respect, of dignity, of the life she had built, and that she would continue to live it on her own terms, with a quiet grace that could not be taken from her. Grace woke before the first light had touched the edges of her curtains, the air in the room cool and calm, a silence so complete it felt like a soft breath against her skin. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet, her mind sifting through the days that had brought her here, to this point where she could wake without the weight of fear pressing on her chest, where she could feel her own breath and know it was hers alone, to hold, to direct, to honor. There was a steadiness in the way she rose from the bed, a calm that had settled in her bones, in the way she smoothed her blankets and opened her curtains, letting the soft gray light spill into the room, illuminating the small framed photographs on her dresser, each one a quiet testimony to the life she had lived, the choices she had made, the love she had given without measure. In the kitchen, the scent of coffee drifted around her as she moved through the small motions of her morning, placing the kettle on the stove, pulling down her favorite mug, the one with the delicate blue flowers around the rim, the edges worn smooth from years of use. She opened the window above the sink, letting the early breeze move through the house, carrying with it the scent of wet grass and the promise of a new day. She looked out over her small yard, the pots of herbs she had planted now growing in uneven but determined rows, the leaves catching the light as they moved gently in the morning air, and she felt a quiet pride in the small life she had built here, a life that belonged to her in every detail, from the worn handle of the coffee pot to the creak of the floorboards in the hallway. The days since her conversation with Michael had unfolded with a gentle steadiness, each one a quiet affirmation of the choice she had made to protect herself, to live her life with the dignity she had earned. There had been moments of doubt, small flashes of guilt that tried to whisper to her in the quiet, reminding her of the expectations she had carried for so long, of the roles she had filled without question, but she had let those whispers pass, acknowledging them without allowing them to take root. Instead, she had chosen to let her days be filled with the small tasks that brought her comfort and purpose, baking bread for the church, tending to her garden, reading in the afternoons as the light moved across her living room floor, the pages turning quietly beneath her fingers. She had returned to the women's group at the church, each meeting a reminder of the community she was a part of the women who had become a quiet circle of strength around her. They shared stories of their lives, of the children they had raised, of the challenges they had faced, of the small victories they claimed each day simply by waking and choosing to continue. Grace listened, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea as she nodded, offering her own stories when the moments felt right, finding comfort in the way they accepted each word without judgment, each silence without question, their presence a gentle reminder that she was seen, that she was valued, that she was not alone. There was a small park near the church, and Grace had taken to walking there in the mornings after the meetings, the path winding beneath old oak trees, the leaves overhead catching the light in shifting patterns that moved across her face and hands as she walked. She would sit on a bench near the pond, watching the ducks move across the water, the ripples catching the reflection of the sky, the branches dipping low near the edges where the water met the grass. In those moments, she allowed herself to simply be, to let the world move around her without demanding anything from her, to feel the quiet joy of her own company, the gentle realization that she was enough exactly as she was, without giving more of herself than she chose. One morning, as she sat on the bench watching the breeze move across the water, she thought of Michael, of the boy he had been, of the man he had become, of the space that had grown between them in ways she had not wanted but could no longer deny. She thought of the look on his face when she had told him of her decision, the surprise in his eyes, the way his mouth had opened and closed as he searched for the right words, the silence that had followed, a silence she had let be, refusing to fill it with apologies or explanations. She missed him, in a way that was deep and quiet, a longing that would always live within her, but she also knew that loving him did not mean surrendering herself, that being his mother did not mean giving up the life she had fought to build. Later that week, she received a message from Michael, a short note asking if they could meet, if she would come to his home for dinner, just the two of them. She read the message twice, her thumb hovering over the screen as she considered her response, The familiar urge to immediately say yes, to move toward him without hesitation, rising within her before she let it settle, replaced by a steady calm that allowed her to choose, truly choose, her answer. She wrote back simply, a single word that held both her love and her boundaries. Yes. The evening she arrived at Michael's home, the sky was a deep blue, the first stars beginning to appear as she parked her car and walked up the path to his door. The small tin of cookies she had baked held in her hands, the warmth of them rising through the foil as she paused on the porch, taking a deep breath before she knocked. Michael opened the door with a smile that was cautious but genuine, stepping back to let her in, his hands moving quickly as he took the cookies from her, placing them on the counter before guiding her to the dining table, where 2 plates were set, the scent of roasted vegetables and warm bread filling the air. They spoke quietly as they ate, the conversation light, moving through safe topics of work and small stories of the neighborhood, the careful politeness of 2 people who loved each other but were learning how to exist with the new space between them. Grace listened, nodding, sharing small stories of her own, her words steady, her laughter soft but genuine when the moments came. She noticed the way Michael's eyes moved to the small stack of papers on the side table, a new set of documents that he did not mention, though the weight of them sat in the room like a quiet question waiting to be asked. When the plates were cleared, when the coffee was poured and the soft hum of the dishwasher began in the background, Michael finally reached for the papers, his fingers drumming softly against the table as he looked at her, his eyes searching hers with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He began to speak, his words careful, explaining that these documents were different, that they were simply for ease, for peace of mind, for ensuring that things would be smooth should anything happen. Grace listened, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, the warmth grounding her as she let him speak, the steady calm within her holding firm as she reached into her bag and pulled out the folder Clara had prepared for her, placing it on the table between them with a quiet, deliberate motion. Michael's words faltered as he looked at the folder, his eyes moving from it to her face, his expression shifting as he opened it and saw the documents inside, the clear evidence of the steps she had taken to protect herself, to secure her life, to establish the boundaries she needed. There was a long moment of silence, the air between them filled with the soft hum of the dishwasher, the distant sounds of the neighborhood outside, the quiet settling over them as they sat across from each other, the truth of who they were and what they needed resting between them. Grace spoke softly, her words clear and calm, explaining that she loved him, that she trusted him, but that her life was hers to protect, that the choices she had made were not a rejection of him, but a promise to herself, a promise to honor the life she had built, the independence she had earned, the dignity she refused to surrender. She explained that she would always be his mother, that her love for him would not change, but that love did not mean erasure, that care did not mean control, that she had chosen to protect herself because she deserved that protection, because she had spent her life giving, and now it was her time to choose herself. Michael listened, his eyes on hers, the lines of worry on his face softening as he nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he let out a breath he had been holding. He closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table before reaching across to take her hand, his grip warm and firm, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary she had set, of the strength she had shown, of the respect he owed her, not because she demanded it, but because she deserved it. When Grace left that evening, the sky was dark, the stars bright above her as she walked to her car, the cool air brushing against her skin, the quiet of the street wrapping around her like a gentle embrace. She sat in the car for a moment before starting the engine, her hands resting on the steering wheel as she looked up at the sky, the constellations familiar and comforting, the steady light of them a reminder that some things remained constant, even as the world shifted and changed around her. As she drove home, the streets empty and quiet, she felt a peace settle into her, a quiet joy that came not from the absence of struggle, but from the strength she had found within herself, from the choices she had made, from the freedom she had claimed. She knew there would still be days when the weight of expectation tried to press against her, when the whispers of guilt would attempt to creep back into the edges of her mind. But she also knew that she had the strength to stand firm, to protect herself, to live her life on her terms, with a dignity that could not be taken from her. That night, as she stepped into her home, the warmth of it welcoming her, the soft scent of lavender from the sachets in her dresser drifting through the air, she allowed herself to smile, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes as she turned off the lights and made her way to her bedroom, the quilt her mother had made resting on her bed, the letters tucked safely in the drawer beside her. She changed into her nightgown, pulling the quilt around her as she settled into bed, the softness of it comforting as she closed her eyes, letting the quiet of the house wrap around her, the steady rhythm of her breath the only sound in the room. Grace drifted to sleep with the gentle certainty that she had chosen her freedom, that she had claimed her right to live her life with the dignity and respect she had earned, that she had not surrendered herself to the expectations of others, but had instead stood firm in her own worth, in her own strength, in the quiet, unwavering promise she had made to herself to live her life on her terms, with grace, with courage, and with the quiet, steady love that would always guide her forward. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. Check out our other videos for powerful narratives you won't want to miss. And if this touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.